My name is Emily Carter. I'm 30, and I just closed the largest private wealth account in my firm's history. A $2 million retirement fund for a client who trusted me with money. He wouldn't even show his own wife. I remember standing in the parking lot of my Boston office that Friday. Phone buzzing with a congratulations text from my managing partner, thinking maybe this was finally the year. Everyone back home would stop calling me the practical one. Like it was an insult. I flew to Ohio for my sister Olivia's engagement party 3 days later. I walked into my parents' backyard in the navy blazer. I'd worn to close the deal, and my mother looked at me and said, "You couldn't find something a little more festive?" That was the greeting. 8 years of building spreadsheets for strangers who valued my judgment more than my own family did. And I got critiqued for my blazer before I even got a hug. The backyard was strung with fairy lights, rented from a company I recognized because I'd priced out the exact same package for a corporate client's holiday. Gala 40 guests, an open bar, a 3-tier cake that probably cost more than my first month's rent when I was 22. And living on ramen while I studied for my CFA exam at 1 a.m. Olivia was radiant in the center of it, laughing at something her fiancé Blake said, her ring catching the light every time she moved her hand. She's 26. She's never held a job longer than 8 months. She's also, apparently, the one who deserves this. I heard my aunt say it first, near the drink table, not even lowering her voice. Well, you know how it is. Olivia was always going to need more help. Emily's always been so self-sufficient. Self-sufficient. Like it was a diagnosis instead of 8 years of me eating gas station sandwiches, so I could max out a savings account. Nobody else knew the balance. I want you to understand something before this story gets worse, because it does get worse. I hadn't told my family how much I'd saved. Not the exact number, not because I was hiding it maliciously. I just knew, instinctively, the way you know not to leave your wallet open on a table full of strangers, that some numbers change how people look at you. I grabbed a plate of food I didn't want, just to have something to do with my hands, and found a seat near the edge of the patio where I could watch without being watched. My Uncle Ray came over, beer in hand, and clapped me on the shoulder, hard enough that I nearly dropped my fork. "There she is, Miss Boston, still crunching numbers for rich people." "Something like that," I said. "Must be nice," he said, not unkindly, but not kindly either, and wandered off before I could answer. That's the other thing nobody tells you about being the responsible one. People assume your stability means you don't need anything. They congratulate you on your success, in the same breath they use to explain why you don't require the same softness they extend to everyone else. If you've ever sat in a room full of people who share your blood and still felt like a guest at your own life, drop a comment. I need to know. I'm not the only one who's done that math. My father found me by the dessert table around 9. He had that look, the one where his jaw is relaxed but his eyes are already negotiating. You got a minute?" We walked to the side of the house, past the recycling bins, away from the string lights. The air smelled like cut grass and citronella candles, and somewhere behind us I could hear Olivia's laugh cutting through the music, bright and easy. In a way mine hadn't sounded in years. My father rubbed the back of his neck, a habit I'd catalogued since childhood as the physical prelude to a request I wouldn't like. "The venue for the wedding fell through," he said. "The Ashford estate. Olivia's had her heart set on it since she was 15. I nodded slowly. "Okay, what's the backup?" "There isn't one, not one she wants." He looked at the ground, then back at me. "We were hoping. Your mother and I were hoping. You might be able to help bridge things, just until the wedding fund catches up." I remember my hand tightening slightly around my glass, not shaking, not yet, just tightening the way it does when a client asks me to bend a number. "I know I can't bend. Bridge things how much?" He said a number that made the ice in my drink feel very loud against the glass. I told him I'd think about it. I did not tell him that number represented 4 years of a house down payment. I'd been building line by line, deposit by deposit, in an account I'd nicknamed, privately, stupidly, sentimentally, home. Before I left that night, my mother hugged me at the door, longer than usual, and said, "You've always been the one we could count on, Emily. That's a gift, you know. Not everyone gets a daughter like you." At the time I thought it was a compliment. I didn't yet understand it was a job description. I flew back to Boston 2 days later for a work trip to Chicago. 3 weeks of client meetings I couldn't reschedule. I told my mother I'd call her when I landed to talk more about the venue situation. She said, "Take your time, sweetheart, there's no rush," in a voice so soft I actually believed her. I want you to sit with that sentence for a second. There's no rush, because in exactly 19 days, there would be nothing left to rush toward. Chicago was 3 weeks of 11-hour days, hotel gyms at 6 a.m., and client dinners where I smiled and talked about diversified portfolios. While my phone buzzed with unanswered texts from my mother that I told myself I'd respond to properly once I had a free evening. That's the thing. Nobody tells you about being the reliable one. You get so used to holding everyone else's world together that you stop checking whether your own is still standing. Somewhere around day 10, I noticed my mother's texts had changed tone. Less, "How's Chicago?" More, "Call when you can." Nothing urgent. I remember reading that phrase, nothing urgent, 3 separate times on 3 separate days, and each time I filed it away under things I'd get to later. I didn't know yet that nothing urgent is what people say right before they hand you something that will change your life. On day 16, Olivia posted a photo. A house. Not a rental listing, not a Pinterest board, an actual for sale sign, half torn out of a lawn I recognized instantly, because it was mine, my hydrangeas. My mailbox, the one I'd repainted myself the summer I closed on the place. The caption read, "Can't wait to build new memories here. Bless new chapter." I stared at that caption for what felt like a full minute before my brain would even process the words in the right order. New chapter. My chapter, my house, I called her. No answer. I called my mother. No answer. I called my father, and on the 4th ring he picked up, and I heard, in the background, the unmistakable clink of champagne glasses. "Dad," I said, and my voice came out flatter than I expected. Flat the way it gets, right? Before I present bad quarterly numbers to a room full of people who don't want to hear them. Whose house is Olivia standing in front of in that photo? There was a pause, a long one. The kind of pause that, in my line of work, means someone's about to tell you the audit found something. "Emily," he said, "we need to talk. But not like this. Come home." If you've ever heard 4 words rearrange your entire understanding of your own family in real time, you already know what that silence sounded like on the other end of the phone. I didn't say anything else. I hung up, opened my banking app with a thumb that wasn't steady, and watched the loading wheel spin for what felt like an hour. Then the number loaded. Not the number I expected. Not close 14,068 years. One number. $14.06. I sat on the edge of a hotel bed in downtown Chicago, still in my blazer, staring at a screen that had just told me, in the coldest language possible, that everything I'd built quietly for myself had been dismantled, just as quietly by the people who were supposed to protect it. I didn't cry. I want to be honest with you about that, because it surprised me too. What I felt instead was something colder, something more precise. The exact feeling I get when a client's numbers don't reconcile, and I know before I even open the ledger that somewhere in those columns, someone's lied to me on purpose. My hands found my laptop before my brain had fully caught up with what they were doing. I logged into my bank's transaction history, scrolling backward through 8 years compressed into a single screen, watching the balance drop in stages I hadn't authorized. A withdrawal here, a transfer there, each one dated, each one time-stamped, each one a small crime I hadn't known was happening. While I sat in conference rooms 3 states away, I booked the next flight to Ohio. I didn't sleep on the plane. I spent the entire flight doing what I do best, not grieving, not panicking, but calculating. Every deposit, every year, every dollar I could account for, laid out in my head like a spreadsheet with a hole punched straight through the middle of it. Because here's the thing about being the responsible one in a family that doesn't respect responsibility. Eventually, you stop asking why they did it to you. You start asking what evidence they left behind. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't a story about a wedding. It's a story about the moment I stopped being a daughter and started being a forensic accountant, investigating my own family. And chapter 2 is where I start pulling the paperwork. The house smelled wrong before I even got the key in the door, which shouldn't have surprised me, since it wasn't my key anymore and it wasn't my door. I stood on the porch of the house I'd closed on 4 years ago. My name still technically listed as owner. In the last documents I'd personally signed, and watched a moving truck idle in the driveway, while two strangers carried a leather sectional through the front door. I'd repainted the same weekend. I repainted the mailbox. A woman in her 50s glanced at me with the mild suspicion people reserve for someone loitering on a lawn that isn't theirs. "Can I help you?" she asked. "This is my house," I said. She smiled the tight, apologetic smile of someone who has clearly been warned this might happen. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. We closed on this 3 weeks ago. Everything's in order. You'd have to talk to the sellers. 3 weeks ago." I did the math standing right there on the porch. The way I do math under pressure, fast and cold. 3 weeks ago was 6 days before I'd even landed in Chicago. This hadn't happened while I was away. It had been planned before I left. My father was waiting at my parents' house when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee. He wasn't drinking. Just holding the way you hold something when you need your hands to be doing anything other than shaking. My mother stood by the sink, arms crossed, chin lifted in a posture I recognized from every argument we'd had since I was 14. The posture of someone who has already decided she's not wrong. "Sit down," my mother said. Not "I'm sorry." Not "let me explain." Sit down like I was the one who needed managing. I didn't sit. "Where is my money? It went to the wedding," my father said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "The house too. We used the equity as collateral to close the venue deposit, and then Emily, we just needed the rest to cover everything. You sold my house." "You weren't using it," my mother snapped, and something in her voice cracked open, defensive and immediate, like she'd rehearsed this. "You were in Boston. You barely came home. That house was sitting empty while your sister needed." "I was building a life in that house," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steady in the specific way. I've trained myself to sound in rooms where someone is trying to make me feel unreasonable for asking basic questions. I furnished 2 rooms. I paid the mortgage every single month for 4 years. I painted that mailbox with my own hands the summer after I closed. My mother's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. "Your sister deserved this wedding more than you needed a house." I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to. Not "we made a mistake." Not "we panicked and did something wrong." A calm, settled statement of value. Olivia deserved more than I needed. If you've ever had a parent say something so plainly cruel that it almost sounded reasonable in the moment, drop a comment, because I need to know how long it took you to realize it wasn't reasonable at all. I didn't argue. I want to be honest about that, because arguing was the old version of me, the version that used to think, if I just explained my side clearly enough, someone would finally hear it. That version of me died somewhere on the flight from Chicago. What replaced her didn't want an apology. She wanted paperwork. "I need copies of everything," I said. "The sale documents, the bank withdrawals, all of it." My father actually reached toward a folder on the counter. An instinct, I think, born from 30 years of being the one who keeps the family's paperwork in order. Before my mother put her hand over his. "Why do you need copies?" "It's done, Emily. It's over." "Because I'm not asking as your daughter right now," I said. "I'm asking as someone with 8 years of professional experience, reading exactly this kind of document." That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, still smelling faintly of the same fabric softener my mother had used since 2004, and I called the one person I trusted completely with numbers that didn't add up. Priya Nair, a forensic accountant. I'd worked with on 2 fraud cases at the firm, someone who could read a bank statement, the way other people read a grocery list. "Send me everything you can get your hands on," she said, her voice crackling slightly over the line. "Statements, closing documents, anything with a signature on it. If your name is on that mortgage, Emily, nobody can sell that house without your authorization. Somebody signed something." I spent the next 4 days doing what I do best. Except this time the client was myself. I drove to my bank's local branch and requested a full transaction history, watching the teller's face shift slightly as she read the withdrawal dates. 6 separate transfers, over 11 days, each one just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic fraud alert. Someone had known exactly where that threshold sat. I sat in my car, in the bank parking lot, with the printed statements on the passenger seat, and for the first time since Chicago, my hands actually shook. Not from sadness, from the specific, cold recognition of premeditation. This wasn't panic. This was a plan, executed with the kind of patience that only comes from someone who'd thought about it for a long time before they ever touched a dollar. I drove to the county recorder's office next. The smell of old paper and toner thick in the air, fluorescent lights humming overhead, while a clerk pulled the deed transfer for my house. My signature was on the transfer of sale. Except it wasn't my signature, not the way I actually sign my name, with the small loop on the E I've had since middle school. This signature was close. Close enough to fool someone glancing quickly, not close enough to fool me. If you've ever stared at your own name written by someone else's hand, you know there's a very specific kind of cold that runs through you. It's not anger yet. It's recognition. I photographed every page before I left the building. I photographed the withdrawal slips. I photographed the notarization stamp on the deed, and later that night, when I searched the notary's license number against the state registry, I found something that made my stomach drop through the floor of my childhood bedroom. The notary's license had been expired for 4 months at the time of signing. Someone hadn't just forged my signature. They'd used a notary who legally had no authority to notarize anything. I called my aunt the next morning, careful, casual, asking about the engagement party, easing into questions about the wedding planning timeline. She mentioned, without any idea what she was handing me, that my mother had been working with someone to speed up the paperwork weeks before I'd even flown to Chicago. A family friend, she said. Someone who used to do this kind of thing professionally, weeks before the engagement party, before my mother hugged me at the door and told me I'd always been the one they could count on. I sat with that information, the way I sit with a client's numbers, when I already suspect the fraud, but haven't proven it yet. Quiet, methodical, refusing to let the anger get ahead of the evidence, because I already knew what I was going to do with what I found. I just needed enough of it that no one in that family could talk their way around it. By the end of that week, I had a folder of my own, bank statements. The deed, the notary registry printout, a timeline built hour by hour that placed the first fraudulent withdrawal, 9 days before my parents had even asked me for money at that engagement party. They hadn't asked me because they needed help. They'd asked me because they'd already taken it, and they were buying themselves time to figure out how to tell me. If you've ever built a case against people who taught you how to tie your shoes, you already know. Chapter 3 is where the math finally becomes undeniable. Because I was done being their daughter, I was becoming their auditor. 3 is stopped answering my mother's calls on a Tuesday, and by Thursday she'd switched tactics. Texts that read less like apologies and more like status updates, as if I were a vendor she needed to keep from canceling a contract. Weddings in 12 days. Can we please just talk like adults? I sat in the guest bedroom of my old college roommate's apartment, the only place I had to stay now that I technically owned no property in the state of Ohio, and I read that text 4 times, like adults. As if the adult conversation wasn't the one where I'd found my forged signature on a deed transfer, notarized by a man with an expired license. My roommate, Dana, knocked on the doorframe around 9 that night, holding 2 mugs of tea. She sat down without asking if I wanted one. The kind of quiet care you only get from someone who's known you since you were 19, and broke and stubborn about admitting either. You've been staring at that same screen for 3 hours, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. I'm building a spreadsheet, I said. Of what? Of everything I've ever given them. Dana didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at the screen, at the growing columns, and finally said, Emily, that's not a spreadsheet, that's an autopsy. She wasn't wrong, but I kept typing anyway, because some part of me needed to see the shape of it, laid out in black and white, before I could believe it was real. Priya called that same week with the first full read of the documents I'd sent her. Emily, I need you to hear this clearly, she said, her voice carrying the flat precision I recognized from every case briefing we'd ever done together. This isn't a family disagreement anymore. This is bank fraud and forgery, and depending on how the notary's involved, it might be conspiracy. You understand that, right? I did understand it. I'd understood it for days. What I hadn't understood yet, what I was only starting to understand sitting in that borrowed bedroom with my laptop, balanced on my knees, was how long it had actually been happening. Because the deeper I went into the statements, the older the pattern got. 3 years back, there was a withdrawal of $4,000 from an account I'd once let my mother access just for emergencies after my grandmother's hospital stay. I remembered that withdrawal. I remembered forgiving it instantly because that's what you do for family, isn't it? You don't itemize love. Except, apparently, somewhere along the way, I'd become the only one not itemizing. I built a spreadsheet. I want to tell you, I resisted the urge that some healthier part of me said, don't turn your grief into a ledger. But that healthier part of me had gone quiet weeks ago, replaced by the version of me that solves problems for a living. Column 1, date column 2, amount column 3, stated purpose where I could find one. By the time I finished, the number in the bottom row wasn't just the $14.06 that had started this. It was closer to $210,000, spread across 8 years, moving in one direction only, toward Olivia. Every single time. Braces I'd paid for when my parents said money was tight. A car loan to Olivia at 22 that was never repaid and never mentioned again. A security deposit on an apartment she'd lived in for 5 months before moving back home. A temporary credit card my mother had asked to borrow my name for, back when I was 24 and desperate to feel needed. And now a house and a life savings converted into a 3-tier cake and an open bar. I sat with the spreadsheet open on my screen for a long time. And I want to describe what that moment actually felt like, because it wasn't the crying on the kitchen floor moment people expect from stories like this. My jaw tightened first. I could feel it in my molars, a pressure I didn't consciously create. Then my hands went very still, unnaturally still, the way they go still, right before I present findings that are going to end someone's career. I wasn't grieving a family anymore. I was closing an audit. If you've ever done the math on what you've given people who never once considered doing the same for you, drop a comment. Because that number changes something in you that doesn't change back. My phone rang. My father this time, not my mother, which told me something on its own. They were rotating negotiators. Please, he said, and his voice had the particular rasp of someone who hadn't slept. Your mother didn't mean it the way it sounded. We're your family. We made a mistake. But we're still your family. You forged my signature, I said, quiet, flat. You used an unlicensed notary. You took money out of my account in increments specifically designed to avoid fraud alerts. Dad, that's not a mistake. A mistake is forgetting a mortgage payment. What you did took planning. Silence on the line. Long enough that I could hear, faintly, wedding preparations happening somewhere behind him. Someone laughing, glassware clinking, a florist confirming a delivery time. We didn't think you'd need it, he finally said. You always land on your feet, Emily. You always have. There it is. The sentence I'd been circling for 8 years without ever quite landing on it myself. The sentence that explained every skipped birthday gift, every, you understand, right? Every time my success had been treated less like an achievement and more like a resource. I always landed on my feet, so nobody worried about whether the ground underneath me was actually solid, or whether I'd built it myself, plank by plank, while they weren't watching. I wasn't a daughter to this family. I was infrastructure. Something reliable you build on top of and never have to maintain, because it's simply expected to hold. I need you to understand something, I told my father, and my voice didn't shake, not even slightly, which surprised me more than anything else that week. I'm not asking for the money back as your daughter anymore. I've retained a lawyer. Her name is Wendy Sokolov, and she specializes in financial fraud between family members. You'll hear from her by Monday. Emily, the wedding is in 12 days, I said. I'd think very carefully about who you invite. I hung up before he could respond, and I sat there in the borrowed quiet of that guest bedroom, waiting for the guilt to arrive the way it always had before, that old automatic pull to call back and soften it, to make sure everyone still liked me. It didn't come. What came instead was something closer to clarity, cold and complete, the feeling of watching the last column of a spreadsheet. Finally balance, after hours of searching for the error. Donna appeared in the doorway again a few minutes later, and I must have looked different. Because she paused before asking, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly before answering. Like I just found the decimal error that's been throwing off an entire ledger for 8 years. That's not a feeling, Emily. It is for me. I called Wendy that evening and walked her through everything. The statements, the deed, the notary registry, the timeline that placed the first fraudulent withdrawal weeks before my family had ever asked me for a dime. She was quiet while I spoke, the kind of quiet that meant she was building a case in real time, a pen scratching steadily somewhere on her end of the line. There's something else, I told her, my hand hovering over my laptop trackpad. My old house has a security system, cloud storage, 90-day retention. I never canceled the subscription because I forgot I still had access after the sale. Emily, Wendy said slowly, please tell me you're about to say what I think you're about to say. I opened the app. 90 days of footage, still sitting there, untouched, because whoever forged my signature on that deed hadn't thought to check whether the cameras I'd installed were still reporting to my account instead of theirs. I scrolled backward, past strangers unpacking boxes, past a delivery driver, past my mother's car, pulling into the driveway on a date I recognized instantly from my spreadsheet, 3 days before I'd even flown home for the engagement party. The footage showed her letting a man in a gray sedan into the house. He carried a leather folder. He left 40 minutes later. I think, I said, my voice very steady. I just found the moment my mother let a stranger into my house to notarize a document with my name on it. Wendy exhaled slowly on the other end. Send me that footage tonight. Don't wait until morning. I did. I sat up until nearly 2 a.m. making sure the files uploaded correctly, watching the progress bar creep across the screen. The same way I once watched loading screens for client transfers worth millions of dollars. Except this time, what was loading wasn't money. It was proof. 12 days until the wedding. And for the first time since I'd landed back in Ohio, I wasn't the one who needed to prepare for a confrontation. They were. 4. The Ashford estate looked exactly like the venue Olivia had dreamed about since she was 15. White orchids cascading down every table, a string quartet warming up near the terrace, 200 guests in their finest, champagne already flowing before the ceremony had even started. I stood at the edge of the parking lot in a charcoal suit, Wendy beside me in flats she'd specifically chosen for standing on gravel for an extended period, and watched my family's entire world spin inside a building none of it actually belonged to anymore. Last chance, Wendy said quietly. We can still do this quietly. Serve the papers Monday. Avoid the spectacle. I thought about my mother's voice at the door of that backyard party, telling me I'd always been the one they could count on. I thought about the notary's expired license, the forged loop on my signature, the security footage of a stranger walking into my house with a leather folder full of documents that would erase 8 years of my life. I thought about $14.06 on a hotel bed in Chicago. No, I said. They didn't do this quietly. I'm not cleaning it up quietly. Wendy nodded once, the way she does when a decision's been made and there's no point relitigating it, and reached into her bag for the folder she'd been carrying since we left the car. My hands were steady. I noticed that, actually. Noticed it the way you notice weather, a fact about the day, rather than a feeling I was managing. 8 years of boardrooms had prepared me for exactly one moment, and it wasn't the one I'd expected. We walked in during the reception, right as the best man's toast was winding down, right as Olivia was laughing at something. Blake whispered in her ear. 2 investigators from the County Fraud Division flanked us, along with a process server, holding an envelope that would end up mattering more than every centerpiece in that room combined. A photographer near the cake table lowered his camera slowly, sensing correctly that whatever happened next was the real photo of the night. If you've ever watched an entire room go silent in the space of one held breath, you already know exactly how the string quartet trailed off mid-note when my mother saw me walk in. Mrs. Carter. One of the investigators stepped forward, badge visible, voice calm and procedural, in a way that made it land even harder. We have a warrant to discuss financial documents related to the transfer of a property at 214 Birchwood Lane, along with several banking transactions flagged for forgery and fraud. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do before. Not anger, not embarrassment, just a kind of frozen arithmetic. The same calculation I'd been running for weeks, now finally showing up on her own face. My father stood, chair scraping loudly against the floor, his mouth opening and closing without finding words. My Aunt Carol's hand pressed flat against her chest, her wine glass forgotten, and tilting dangerously in her other hand, until my Uncle Ray quietly took it from her. "This is a wedding," my father said, weak. Like the sentence itself was supposed to be a legal defense. "It was paid for with stolen money," I said, and my voice carried further than I intended in a room that quiet. "My money." I laid the folder on the head table myself. Bank statements with 6 withdrawals timed just under the fraud alert threshold. The deed with my forged signature, the loop on the E, subtly provably wrong. The notary's license, expired 4 months before he'd stamped a document that sold my house out from under me, and a printed still from my own security footage. My mother, opening the front door of my house for a stranger with a leather folder, 3 days before I'd even flown home for the engagement party. Guests began pulling out their phones, not to record, at first, but out of the instinct people have when they sense something historic happening in a room they didn't expect to witness history in. A woman 2 tables over, someone I vaguely recognized as a family friend, whispered something to her husband, both of them staring at my mother like they'd never actually seen her before. Olivia stood up in her wedding dress, mascara already streaking. "Emily, how could you do this today, of all days?" "I didn't do this today," I said, and I felt something in my chest finally, fully unclench, 8 years of held breath releasing all at once. Mom and Dad did this 3 weeks before I even came home. I'm just the one who's making sure everyone finally sees the receipts. Blake, to his credit, didn't say a word in Olivia's defense. He looked at the folder, then at Olivia, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. The specific, quiet recalibration of a man, realizing the family he was marrying into had built a wedding on a foundation that wasn't theirs to build on. If you've ever needed the truth to be witnessed, not just known, but seen, in front of every person who ever doubted you, drop a comment right now. Because that's exactly what that room became. The investigation moved faster than even Wendy expected. Mostly because the evidence didn't leave room for interpretation. The notary lost his license entirely and was charged separately for notarizing a fraudulent document while unlicensed. My parents were charged with forgery and bank fraud, the specifics of which unfolded over months in a courtroom that smelled like old wood polish and stale coffee. Nothing like the warm citronella-lit backyard where this had all started. I sat in that courtroom more times than I expected to. Notepad in my lap out of habit. The same habit that had once served $2 million clients now aimed at the 2 people who'd raised me. Wendy sat beside me each time, occasionally leaning over to translate legal phrasing into plain language, though by that point I understood most of it on my own. My mother took the stand during the civil proceedings, and for one long moment, I thought she might finally say something honest. Instead, she said, "We thought we'd pay her back eventually. We didn't think it would matter this much to her." I watched the judge's face when she said that. It mattered enough to matter, and the judge clearly agreed, because the ruling that followed restored the house to my name, ordered full restitution of every stolen dollar, and referred the criminal elements of the case for prosecution. My father took a plea deal, cooperating fully, his testimony detailing exactly how the notary had been sourced through a family friend who owed him a favor. My mother didn't take a deal, and lost. I didn't attend sentencing. Wendy asked if I wanted updates sent to me in real time, or in a weekly summary, and I chose the weekly summary, because I'd spent 8 years living my entire life around other people's emergencies. And I was done, letting even their consequences dictate my calendar. The house came back to me technically clean, but emotionally strange. My hydrangeas still alive. The mailbox I'd painted still standing. But everything inside felt like it belonged to someone I used to be. I repainted the front door a different color. Small thing, it mattered more than I expected. Dana helped me move back in over a single weekend, the 2 of us eating pizza on the floor of an empty living room, because I hadn't yet decided which furniture felt like mine again. I want to say something here, and I'm not going to dress it up, the way people usually do at the end of these stories. Loving your family and protecting yourself from them are not opposites. I used to think setting a boundary with people who raised me was a kind of betrayal. It isn't. What actually happens when you let people keep taking, without ever asking what it costs you, is that you eventually stop existing as a person to them and start existing as a resource, dependable, convenient, and quietly used up. That's not family. That's a subsidy. I didn't take the money and run in some dramatic final scene. I met with a financial planner 3 months later. A colleague, actually, someone I trust the way I used to trust people by default, and rebuilt the account I'd nicknamed Home. This time with restrictions no one could quietly override. Joint access for anyone isn't generosity. It's a vulnerability, and I'd paid a very expensive tuition to learn the difference. My father calls occasionally now. Short calls, careful ones. We're rebuilding something smaller and more honest than what we had before, which might be the only kind of relationship that was ever actually true to begin with. My mother and I haven't spoken since the ruling. I'm not closing that door permanently. I'm just not the one required to keep it open anymore. Olivia reached out once months later, not to apologize, but to ask if I could help her understand the whole legal thing for a job application that required a background check. I said no. It wasn't cruelty. It was the first complete sentence of a boundary I should have learned to speak years earlier. If this story hit somewhere real for you, if you've ever been the responsible one, the reliable one, the one everyone assumed would be fine, no matter what got taken from you, you're not alone, and you're not wrong for finally doing the math. Subscribe to Shadow Drama Stories for more, because this channel exists for every person who's ever had to learn the hard way that being trusted with everything doesn't mean you're valued at all. Drop a comment below, telling me where you'd have drawn your line, and I'll see you in the next story.